a little bit over, so if I do, I apologize. So, morning, everyone. And I'd like to thank Debbie and her team for inviting me today to speak about this very important issue, an issue that, needs to be discussed and should be discussed with young people, because we don't want racism. Racism's a disease. It's toxic. It's not good for society. And it's not a world that I want to live in where there is racism. So it's great that we're having this debate today, and it's important that we're having it, particularly now. It's significant now. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. I'm a solicitor. I work in residential housing law. So I represent mainly tenants who find themselves in financial dire straits, who can't pay their rents, and the landlords want to evict them because of rent arrears or antisocial behaviour. So it's my job to negotiate, represent them at court. I also deal with tenants who are living in substandard accommodation, where the landlords won't do the repairs. So again, it's about making sure that the tenant has somewhere decent to live. I do a lot of work at the county court. So we have a duty scheme there where people can come along if they've got a court hearing that day, and we can give them legal advice or represent them at court, because it's important that people have access to justice, especially in relation to something as important as their home. Your home is one of the most important commodities that you have, and it should be there and it should be available for your own security and so on. Aside from that, I'm also a counsellor, as Debbie said, in Kirklees in Huddersfield with Harpreet Uppal. And as a counsellor, I go from representing people to actually representing a particular area, making sure that, residents in the area, that their well-being is being considered, making sure that the area is well resourced and that people are looked after, dealing with a whole host of issues from crime and disorder to housing to environmental issues, highways, businesses, and all those things. So two very important roles, two very key important roles. But although I'm a counsellor, I'm the first and only Black counsellor of Kirklees. So I see my role as being quite unique in that a lot of people from the African and African Caribbean community will approach me because they trust me and they feel that I understand their issues. And they will speak to me about things like racism that they've experienced at work or at school, where their children have been unfairly excluded. And that sort of thing. But I've also been involved in creating various groups specifically for African and African Caribbean. So I've been involved in, for example, I was involved in setting up a group called the Windrush Advocacy Group to help people who were affected by the Windrush scandal. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that, but it's where the government changed legislation, making it difficult really for people who came here when they were young to stay in the country, and they're trying to deport them, which we believe is a racist policy and legislation. So what's been happening is people, because while they're being investigated to see whether they meet the criteria, they're not allowed to do things like work, claim benefits, get free medical care. So if anything happens, they need to go to the doctors or the hospital. They may be charged for that service. So a lot of these people have lost their homes, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their self-respect, and they need a lot of help and support really to make sure that, they're able to demonstrate that they do have the right to stay and that they're compensated for what they've experienced. So I've been involved in that group. I've also been involved in things like the Windrush Day celebrations. I've been involved in Black History Month programs and also the Huddersfield Carnival. But most recently, I've been involved in setting up a group called the Kirklees Action Board. And what we're doing is we're looking at identifying issues in the Black community to try and, improve conditions for people in the Black community, but also to provide opportunities. So there's a number of areas that I want to focus on. I want to focus on the schools. I want to encourage the schools to look at things like their recruitment process, for the schools to consider how they're recruiting to make sure that their workforce is diverse, that children get to see teachers that look like them, which reflect the area in which they live in. Also for the schools to look at things like their libraries and their reading material to make sure that they're diverse and that they're looking at Black and ethnic minority authors, looking at the school, we can't really be involved in changing the curriculum because that's more of a national issue, but looking at how the schools can introduce diversity into the teaching stuff that they use. So for example, during Black History Month in October, the schools having a Black History Month program, are they being a lot more diverse in how they're dealing with things. I also am looking at employment and training to make sure that young people have, the opportunities. So to do work shadowing, that sort of thing with businesses in the area so that it can improve on their CVs and so they can compete better in the workplace. And also businesses, you young people have got great ideas, but often you don't know what to do with that creativity. So looking at, whether we can support you in setting up your own businesses and how you can go about doing that. So writing business plans, for example, or, getting the financial support that you need, shadowing and that sort. So those are the sorts of things that, I'm working on at the moment. But we're here to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. And as I've said, which is crucial at this time. And I remember, well, the Black Lives Matter movement probably started about 6 years ago. But I remember back in 2016 when we had our first protest in Huddersfield. And it was in response to, what was going on in America with the African Americans and how the police were brutalizing and treating people over there. And we all went out in protest to march in solidarity with our brothers and sisters over there. And at that time, we talked a little bit about what was going on here in our own backyard. But unfortunately, when those protests ended, so did those discussions. So when the episode happened with George Floyd, where people saw, saw how he was treated, saw how, him take his last breaths and how it impacted on people, I think it made a huge difference. I think it sent the lightning bolt through the whole world. And people really started to stand up and listen and talk a lot more and create platforms like these, where we're not just talking about what's going on in America, we're talking about what's going on right here in the UK. We're talking about institutional and systemic racism here. And for me, the Black Lives Matter movement typifies two things. It's about raising awareness that people are aware of what's going on. People understand what institutional racism means. And it's not just Black people, but also white people are starting to have those conversations and to understand white privilege and how it creates, division, how it creates racism and the problems that are as a result of it. Because we know today there are a lot of issues and people need to be talking about these issues. So for example, overrepresentation of Black men being stopped and searched. You're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're Black. And that BAME people have died in custody in this country. It's not just in America. Between 1990 until now, 183 people have died in custody and no one has been prosecuted for that. We know if you're from a BAME background, you're 13 times more likely to be given a higher sentence than a white person for committing the same crime. That's absolutely ridiculous, which results in an overrepresentation in the prison service. And we know that there's racist incidents in the prisons. We know that if you have a non-British sounding name, you are less likely to get an interview and you're less likely to get a job.
Amanda, are you all right to wind up if that's okay?
Almost finished, yes. And also that there was a study in 2018 that found that Black children are 3 times more likely to get harsher punishment, like being excluded from school, than white children for the same behavior. And also most recently, we've heard that if you're from a BAME background, you're more likely to be affected by COVID-19. But the government doesn't seem to take a real interest in why are we affected and how can we deal with those issues. And then finally, during the COVID-19, studies have found that found that 52% of people fined for breaching lockdown rules are from a BAME community. So you're more likely to be fined if you're from a BAME community. So it's important that we're having these discussions today and that people identify these issues and we work towards what we can do to eradicate racism. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Amanda. I'm going to move swiftly on to Vita.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Vita Price and I'm one of the Oldham councillors. Thank you to Debbie and her team for inviting me today and to speak about my life experiences growing up. I was one of 5 children brought up in a mixed race household with a white mother, Scottish, and my father, who was Jamaican. Having a white mother, I was more protected from racism than most. My mother told me of her experiences when she was spat on in the street for having black children. It was because of my mother. She encouraged and pursued my further education in a protected environment in London. Through my mother's friends, in various roles, give me the opportunity when looking for work. My brothers and I were the only black family in our junior school. At the junior school, I remember we had to put our biscuit money in the mission box once a week. At that time, we were told it was for the black babies. In secondary school, we were one of 3 black families of over 1,000 children. I went on to college in London, where I was one of 2 black people who attended. In 2012, I became the first and now the only black councillor in Oldham. I do this alongside of my job in social services. The death of George Floyd wasn't an isolated incident. It sparked off a movement that was long overdue. It has highlighted for the world to see. This movement isn't new. This movement has been going on since Martin Luther King had a dream of equality, and that's the key. To be equal and not superior to others. The Black Lives Matter movement is close to my heart, and that's what it means. Black lives matter. Not matter more. Not all lives don't matter, but black lives matter too. It's the 2 people seem to miss. The racism has always been an issue in the UK. When I was in London, I went into a shop with my 2 white friends. I was told to leave the shop because of my colour. At this time, I didn't really understand why until my friend came out after me, telling the shopkeeper off. My daughter is white. She's grown up being asked, why is she calling that black woman mummy? When we have so many mixed relationships, people's prejudice is highlighted because they don't know who they're speaking to, or even if that person is of colour. You don't have to have a black face to have a black family. Racism is very real in the UK today, and the way to combat this is to speak up about unfair injustices. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vita. That's great. Now moving on to Victoria.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully this will work because I never quite get the hang of it. Can you see what I can see? Which is hopefully a PowerPoint presentation that says, what does Black Lives Matter mean for the charity sector? Fingers crossed.
Not yet, no. Yeah, there it goes.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so I have chosen to talk about my specific experience, like Debbie mentioned, sorry, my mum mentioned at the beginning, in terms of my role within, I have 2 jobs. I work both in prison law and I run a charity that works in the women's sector, and we run a few projects in East Africa, in Kenya and Uganda. And something that's become quite prevalent within the charity sector recently is this notion of the responsibilities in the charity sector in terms of the messages and stereotypes that they're also playing into when it comes to aid work, especially in countries with African or Caribbean people. So I've chosen to look at and advise you of kind of why, or should I say, the methods in which Freedom for Girls, my charity, got wrong when they were looking to do this work initially, and how we've had to readdress the things that we were initially doing in order to support this idea that we want to smash all these racial stereotypes, discrimination, structural and systemic racism that existed within the West, and the message that we paint across the rest of the world. So what does Black Lives Matter mean for the charity? What we're going to talk about really quickly is, what do Freedom for Girls do? Why do we do it? And then what is the message that we get typically from Western-based NGOs and charities that practice in developing countries, specifically in African countries? Then we're going to look at this concept of white saviorism. And finally, if you want to do this work, and it is quite a prevalent thing amongst people who are going through up into A-levels in higher education, like if you're going to go to developing countries to do a bit of volunteering or whatever, what kind of things do you want to consider? What should you be conscious of when you're going to work with these kind of organisations, and how do you want to support the holistic Black Lives Matter movement globally if you're going to do this work as well? So really quickly, Freedom for Girls, we are a UK registered period poverty charity, and what we mean by period poverty is this idea that there's a large selection of the public, as we know, thanks to austerity measures, the increased risk of using food banks, the systemic issues that are affecting significant number of children in poverty. The holistic definition of period poverty now means more than just not being able to afford period products. It also means being able to access products. So there's a lot of people who don't access support services due to disabilities or other reasons, and therefore can't be provided with products as well. The second reason that period poverty exists, that we found through a lot of our evidence-based research, and because we know things like sex-based equality exists, especially in the UK, as well as women's health matters in the UK not really being prioritised, we also look at the failure in the education systems about addressing menstruation for the big and the full issue that it is. And then we also look at societal-based stigmas, shames, negative stereotypes that are associated with periods. So that's the definition that we subscribe to, and it means that in addressing that, I'm just going to skip through these. Sorry, this is a pre-existing presentation, but I know I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm just going to run through these quickly. This is the report actually that came out in the end of 2017 after a lot of grassroots campaigning was done to look at what period poverty meant in the UK. And the issues have risen significantly more since the pandemic. There's been another study that looks at now 54% of girls in the UK are turning to toilet roll instead of being able to access period products. So a really big issue again. And it's prompted our work to look at providing access to a choice of products. So we're really looking to work with a number of period product providers that offers these products that we then donate to people in need. And a significant part, as we know, is or significant number of groups that we work with, sorry, are from BAME backgrounds because of issues like poverty and structural discrimination affecting their economic opportunities to a significantly higher degree. We also run our own sewing workshops in Leeds, so we create washable, reusable pads, economically viable products, environmentally friendly, chemical and plastic free, so healthy for all of our bodies. And we run the same workshops in Kenya, in Watamu and Mombasa, and that's just a picture of the products. And then we run empowerment education sessions, both in Uganda and Kenya and in the UK, and these sessions predominantly look at more than what it is just have a period, holistic issues that a woman and girls go through with their changes to their bodies and periods itself. But like I said, I've chosen to kind of talk about the issues in terms of systemic racism that the charity sector perpetuates, especially in the developing world. So when I've made this presentation, I just pulled these images from Google and I literally just searched for Western NGOs in aid work in Africa. And these are the images that come up, and they're all the same type of depressed, desperate, scared looking children. And we started to take umbrage with this because as a sector, there's a lot more work in terms of generational awareness of, like we talked about before, the systemic issues that are the negative stereotypes that are perpetuated amongst the racial conversation that we're having now around white privilege and white supremacy, and this providing a message that these groups of people are the others, that they look at us as being different because we have this level of privilege in terms of resources and wealth, and that isn't an effective narrative. It's not a realistic narrative, but it has worked historically for the charity sector, because if you see these images, the automatic response would be, oh, poor people, I want to kind of help. But there is an issue with that now, especially if we're looking at working towards racial power plays and looking at providing a realistic narrative, especially of African communities. So again, when I wrote this, I remember thinking, like, what was my personal experience? Like, why did I care about charity? And what did the message look like when I was growing up, when I wanted to do this kind of work? And I remember Lenny Henry's doing the comic relief stuff. I remember there was a really heartbreaking episode with the Rwandan genocide where people were talking, there was a family that had been reunited after genocide. And then the Band-Aid matches, that was a Christmas song for me growing up. Like, I never thought to kind of query some of the lyrics, but I don't know if anyone remembers in 2014 when they did a remake of the song, and so many artists, especially like socially active artists like Lily Allen, Fuse ODG, saying there was no way they were going to take part because it called into question the methods of these organisations and how they were perpetuating, like I said, the negative stereotypes of these communities in terms of their fundraising. What did we need to do therefore differently? And it cringes me to say that Freedom for Girls definitely fed into this stereotype and this narrative, not recognising, like I said, the holistic message that Black Lives Matter wants to portray, removing white privilege and this idea that people, African people in these communities require our help. That's not how it should be, and that's not the effective way to look at moving towards equality. And there I am, embarrassingly again, with my Empower Women t-shirt on, meanwhile asking a bunch of Ugandan beautiful young women and girls to hold up the products that we've provided. So again, this has been a very big learning exercise for the charity that I run in terms of how we can support the Black Lives Matter movement across the world, and looking at removing unconscious bias that these kind of images feed into. I think most people remember the Stacey Dooley saga when she went to Uganda and took a picture with herself and this baby, and her Instagram caption was "obsessed." And so many of my colleagues in Africa called that out. Equally did David Lammy, and as you can see here, he said, we don't need any more white saviours. As I've said before, this just perpetuates tired and unhelpful stereotypes. Instead, we need to be promoting the voices from across the continent and having serious debate. And this is the message now that, like I said, our organisation specifically works to uphold. 4 reasons why it's unhelpful. It perpetuates the idea that African babies are in need of saving, and it fetishises them, removing their humanity. This is significant because there's been such an increase of European paedophiles, unfortunately, as one example, going to countries in particularly East Africa and really enforcing their own narrative of white saviorism being right. Moving on to the second point, perpetuating the concept that white is right and West is best means that when people who are in need in these deprived communities turn to them as being someone that can definitely pick them up, can support them, without actually understanding the context in which this support is going to be provided. So the negative understanding of the different opportunities and resources that can be provided comes both parts. So it's definitely a believed stereotype in the communities that we practice that white is right and West is best, and it's equally, it's fed into from white privilege and white supremacy here. Thanks, Mum. We've said it enforces the idea that foreign aid is the best way in which to fix other countries' issues, which isn't always right. And then I've also said here that the narrative, it just perpetuates again. I've got so many colleagues in Uganda who genuinely can't believe that when we leave university, we are given a car and a 2 up, 2 down house because that's what you get in the West. That's just how we live here. Equally, they think they were shocked when I talked to them about some of the domestic violence cases of women that we work with. The stereotype is fed all the way across the board and goes into the communities there too. So they then themselves also believe that they are the others and they are the ones that need our support because we are right. Just skip through that. So how have we changed our practice? Really, really quickly, sorry. When we do the work now, we automatically survey our staff and service users. We want to understand 100% what we are doing is what they need on the ground there. We also really think about our aesthetic. We don't like any of these more images of white saviorism. And we practice the same policies that we preach here in the UK. Like, if we were to work with some of the children here that we do the education sessions with, I wouldn't dream of taking selfies with the kids here, and we wouldn't be able to do that anyway without consent. Why is the policies and principles any different for these groups of children that we work with on the continent? What is our message? And I'll skip to the next slide when I go into that. But the last thing is, are we representative of the people that we work for? I'm really proud to say that the Black Lives Matter movement that has been sparked again after the murder of George Floyd has led to us thinking specifically about Black women's menstrual health. So we're running a specific project to work around the issues that Black women go through. We know that there is an understanding within the healthcare sector that Black people typically don't experience pain. There's another thing where Black women in pregnancy are one in 5 women, 5 times more likely, to have issues related to their maternal health, because again of systemic racism and these unconscious biases that exist so much. And to finish really quickly, I quote our amazing partner charity in Uganda, the No White Saviours group, who have taught us so much about how we practice and not feeding into these negative stereotypes that perpetuate systemic racism. And it is saying that we never said no white people, we just know that you shouldn't be the heroes of the story. Make sure that you're representative. And in the second point here on the left, remember always the methods in which you're practicing. Always think about the pre-existing prejudices that exist when you are putting that message forward. That's it. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Debbie.
I speak really fast, but it was a long presentation, so there you go.
And last but not least, John.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm going to keep this really short and sweet, so I'll say something very quickly about who I am and my kind of journey through education to put me where I am now, and then talk about what we've put together in terms of the Blackett Lab family and our response to the Black Lives Matters movement. So I'm from South East London. I grew up in an inner city borough where essentially the stereotypes that we hear about associated with the more deprived Black communities were very much the norm. So from a very early age, I was quite passionate about pursuing a different path and forming a different narrative than the one that was set out for me and set out for boys and young people that were like me. From an early age, I was more very much, I experienced the tail end of racism in this country, which was very much just a kind of reaction to the systemic racism that we know about and we've learned about. So that pretty much meant, the racist abuse you hear about in certain areas and different experiences through life were very much just part of the norm. And it was only when I got into university and higher up in the academic world that I realized that racism was very much seeped into the systems that we have in place in this country, to the extent that things are just not set up to promote stories and successes of Black and minority ethnic groups. And it really got me thinking that, there are so many questions and conversations that need to be asked. And Black people have been protesting about these things for many, many years. I think one of the points that was made earlier was that George Floyd and these protests are not anything new. And especially for the young people in the audience, it's really important to emphasize that these things have been happening for years. This is not new at all. And especially not in this country. We can think about Stephen Lawrence many, many years ago, all the way up to now. There are so many names that we can list off who are unfortunately just one in a long line of George Floyd's, all the way back into the 70s and before that. But what I think is really encouraging about what's happened recently is that it seems that for various reasons, I think conversations are starting to happen wider than just in the Black community, where we're protesting against all these injustices that are happening in society and worldwide. And things like this that are happening today are really, really positive, because it's getting everybody part of the conversation, and we're actually starting to now think about what it is that feeds into the systems that are perpetuating this violence that happens again at the tail end, with violence on the streets, but also more just in society, about how injustice and inequality is built into the very structures that we take for granted. So as I said, I kind of went into the education, the academic route, and it was really important to me as a teacher and as assistant head teacher to put on a narrative that was very different to the popular narratives that are publicized and promoted in the media and things like that about what it means to be Black, what it looks like to be Black, and what it looks like to succeed as a Black person. So I think having the academic side is really, really interesting for me. And that's part of the reason why we set up, as I said, the Blackett Lab family, which is a group of Black physicists. And it's a very unique set of people, because you think of a physics, so you think of physics, you think of physicists, you don't think of, or let's say you have an image in your mind that isn't necessarily me, for example, or it doesn't sound like me. So we thought it was really, really important to start something, not necessarily in response to the Black Lives movement, but more so just as a way to put something out there that was different to what has been seen before and what has been heard before. And we've had some really, really good responses to it. So we've got certain different ideas and initiatives that we're putting in place to really, as I said, combat the narratives that are more stereotypically known. And one of those things we called Roots, and Roots is an online discussion program where we talk about lots of different pertinent subjects to the Black community. One of the subjects was, why is there so few Black people in physics? And we speak about the really important topic of underrepresentation, what the causes are for underrepresentation in physics and in academia more widely, and what the systemic issues are around that, and how we can respond to that as a community, as well as, crucially, again at this time, how people who are allies can start to have conversations and start to think about the ways in which they not only feed into the system, but can also start challenging the system as well. So underrepresentation is one of our big priorities, as well as making sure that we're inspiring people as well. Because it's not only always about protesting and being active, there's a place for that as well. But I think there's also a place for being proud of your passions, regardless of what you look like. And I think that in and of itself is something inspiring and something that we're really trying to push forward. So I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, as I said, I'll finish on this point, is not a new movement. It really is yet again a reaction to something that has been happening for years and years and years and years. And Black people, me personally, we tend to look at these things with a touch of skepticism, because we've seen it happen before again and again and again and again. And we're almost like hoping that now real systemic change will take place because of the conversations that are happening more broadly. So it's really great to see things like these taking place, and we hope that some good things come out of it.
Thanks so much, John. Lovely. Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Can we have a round of applause for all the panelists, please? Great stuff. Now, I put on the chat to put your questions up, and we've had Adam was very quick off the mark. So Adam, your chance, and now Zara after that.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yesterday, we had the pleasure of speaking to David Lammy, who's the current Shadow Justice Secretary, and who Victoria included in the presentation. And in his assessment of the Black Lives Matter movement, he provided quite an optimistic outlook for the future. And he said he was reassured by the swathes of protest that we've seen both in this country and the US. And he kind of characterized it as a turning point. And my question to the panelists is whether you think the recent swathes of protests across the world in support of Black Lives Matter, whether you think it will be a time for meaningful change, and what can we as individual members of society, and what can society do as a whole to ensure that this isn't another point in the long history of protests against injustice against Black people, and what can we do to ensure that we kind of seize the moment and ensure that there is meaningful change from this.
Right, you're all popping your questions up. So I've got Zara next, then Sophie, Jonathan, Lucy, Lewis, and Aisha. Oh, Aisha before Lewis, sorry. So Zara, your chance for a question.
Yeah, so my question to the panel is, I've seen a few videos of the British rapper Akala speaking on structural racism in the UK. So how can we educate the youth on the history of this country in systematic structural racism? And how can we inform them the difference of individual racism and structural racism? That's my question.
Thank you. Very, very good question. Sophie, and then we'll ask the panel to answer those three.
Hi. Yesterday when we spoke to David Lammy, he said that he didn't like the term BAME, as in Black and Minority Ethnic. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the use of the term, whether you agreed with it or not.
Okay. Who wants to kick off?
I will.
Go on, Amanda.
Yeah, okay. So Adam, excellent question. How can we ensure there's meaningful change? And it's a huge question. It's very loaded, because I believe that everybody needs to do their bit. Every individual can get involved. Every individual can make a change if they want to. So, you know, parents, employers, the local authority, the government, you know, friends, family, everybody needs to do their bit. And everybody, I think, needs to identify what they can do that can effect change. So I think, and it's also important for people to support groups. So I mentioned the groups that I'm involved in. And what I need is, I need support from people to make these things happen. So I need support from the schools, I need support from the teachers, I need support from the parents, I need the support from local authorities, organizations, businesses, because that's how we're going to make the change. We can see that there's a problem because